Excellent. Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Williams. I am your host of History Author Talks. As many of you know, since many of you are my regular audience, we've taken a bit of a sabbatical. It was a busy time for me in my day job in publishing, but I am now very thrilled to be back with all of you. And I am very pleased at who our guest will be tonight, who I will introduce in just a moment. Our format has changed. Before, as you know, if you were a regular, I had multiple guests and a guest host. I've decided to bring this together and put it all under my own umbrella. So I am going to be your host. And we're also going to be making this a half-hour show instead of an hour-long show. I figured that people were zoomed out, and a half-hour show might just give us a wonderful opportunity to meet our authors and get a taste of what they have written about. So that's what we're going to be doing with History Author Talks. These shows are taped. So if you want to share them, you'll be able to get to historyauthortalks.com and share the shows, because I post them the first thing tomorrow morning. I also wanted to let you know that I am also the co-founder of 10crucialdays.org. 10crucialdays.org is a nonprofit organization that supports and promotes the sites and venues of the Trenton and Princeton campaign. So I hope that you will all visit 10crucialdays.org. We give tours during the holiday season of the battles of Washington crossing the Delaware and the battles of Trenton and Princeton. That's the public history work that I do. I have provided a link at on historyauthortalks.com to purchase our author's book tonight, and I will be putting that link in the chat as well. I have seen who signed up tonight, and I know there's a lot of you out there who are historians yourself, public historians, real historians, and I am looking forward to getting your questions. So use the chat feature to ask our guest your questions. We're going to listen to his presentation, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So without any further ado, I am very pleased to introduce to you this evening William E. Rapp, PhD, is a retired Army Major General, educator, college administrator, and proven leader. With over 30 years of military service. He is a combat veteran of 3 wars, the former commandant of both West Point and the Army War College. He's held numerous other assignments. General Rapp has a significant personal history as a team leader and a well-known professional reputation for developing ethical, courageous, and creative leaders. Full disclosure, I am the publisher of Bill Rapp's book. Published it in my Knox Press imprint. The book is Accomplishing the Impossible, Leadership that Launched Revolutionary Change. So with no further ado, I am very pleased to introduce to you Bill Rapp. Bill, over to you.
It is fantastic to be with you tonight, to be able to chat with you about this new book. This is my first book, and so I'm very excited about it coming out. For me, this book, Accomplishing the Impossible, and I thank Roger for both coming up with the title and for getting it into to print. So thank you. Is put together the 2 loves I have in my post-military life: that of history and developing of the next generation of leaders. So this book is really what the military would call a staff ride in prose. It is about going to the places of history and thinking about not only the history, but putting yourself in the shoes of the leaders that were there, kind of knowing what they know, the decisions that they face, and then seeing those outcomes, and then what we today can learn from them. Because as Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but very often it rhymes. My goal in writing this book is to help leaders lead by thinking about history. And as a political scientist, I think about history and how it can be used to shed light on the present and the future. Sometimes historians might just look at history for history's sake, but this is the big fight between political scientists and historians. But I'm thrilled to be able to offer to you all this book, Accomplishing the Impossible. It is about the Boston Campaign of 1774 to 1776. Why the Boston Campaign? This is where the American Revolution started. Many of you, well, not you, you're a learned historical audience, but many Americans would date the start of the American Revolution to possibly July 4th, 1776. They'd be missing the start by at least 18 months. The full embargo was in place by December of 1774. November 1774, King George III said the New England colonies are now in a state of rebellion. Only blows will decide. By April of 1775, the shooting had stopped at Lexington and Concord, or it had started. The bloody Battle of Breeds Hill, commonly known as Bunker Hill, was June 1775, at least 13 months before that Declaration of Independence. So this is a wonderful period in American history. The characters are alive with both humanity and lessons for us today. And it is just an exciting piece of Americana that we can learn from today. So that's why I wrote it.
Bill, how did you get interested in the American Revolution? I mean, as a student and scholar and educator of military history through the ages, what was it about the American Revolution that really drew you in?
Well, this is a little bit of a place was important. So I ended my service as an active duty Army officer in 2017 and immediately went to Harvard to teach. And so I'm in the Boston area. My love for military history immediately brought me to the early American Revolution. Had I taught at Gettysburg College, this book would be yet another one on Gettysburg and the American Civil War. But I was at Harvard and looking for something that I could help people learn about history and leadership. And I'm in this incredibly rich historical setting of Boston. So place actually drove me to the early American Revolution. Had I been at University of South Carolina, it probably would have been the Southern campaign of the American Revolution that captured my attention. So, it's where you are, and actually going to these places, going to the archives, it's just what historians live for.
So more often than not, historians and authors that I talk to are surprised by people or events that are not commonly believed or understood. What were two or three of some of the surprises that you ran into when you were researching this book?
It's a great question. The very first chapter really revolves around this powder raid on the Cambridge Powder House, now in Somerville, right by Tufts University. And it was a raid on the 1st of September, 1774 by Sir Thomas Gage to steal the militia's gunpowder and get it back under his control in Boston. And it was a brilliantly successful nighttime lightning raid. The regulars came up by boat, they marched up, they grabbed all of the gunpowder, they got it back well before the militia could mobilize or do anything about it. That one act had a couple of different trajectories. The British, in the wake of this incredibly successful raid, tried to do the same thing 3 more times. At Portsmouth in December, in Salem at the end of February, and at Concord in mid-April of 1775. They didn't really adapt in the wake of success. Many companies don't adapt in the wake of great success. And yet the colonials were embarrassed. And out of that came the Minutemen companies, the complete changeover of all leadership, the committees of safety, and the increased emphasis on committees of correspondence with the other colonies, the whole intelligence system of Boston, and the alert rider system to get that intelligence out to outlying towns and colonies, very much popularized by Paul Revere. All of those are adaptations that the colonials made in the wake of that one event, the powder raid of the 1st of September. I knew nothing about that. But when I see organizational adaptation or lack of adaptation, great lessons that can be. One other, and I'll do it very quickly. The amazing ability of the colonial leadership in the wake of the Lexington and Concord actions on 19 April to create a strategic narrative. And more important than that, send it in 2 directions. Having that fast ship, the 62-foot Cuero, waiting in Gloucester Harbor for a leather pouch so they could race that narrative to London and beat Gage's battle report that he sent by his normal packet ship. And then his alert riders, the colonial alert riders, taking that same narrative down to New York, to Philadelphia, to Virginia and beyond, did 2 incredible things. Number one is it convinced most of the British public that why are we fighting the colonials? They are obviously have been wronged. And it convinced the other 12 colonies to join in the Second Continental Congress. Remember, Georgia didn't show up in the First Continental Congress, but not only did they show up, but they created the the Continental Army out of that militia. Those events are amazing as we think about it. And Samuel Adams, just before the Concord raid, said, our role is not to create history, but rather to improve upon it. He is the master at the narrative following events.
So are you suggesting then that part of what the Sons of Liberty and their cadre learned was that for them to be successful and drive their mission forward, there was a propaganda campaign that they were already aware of that they had to put in action, and the British, with their hubris, just weren't ready for that. That the Americans were ready to move their mission forward, and that's the sort of thing that companies have to learn from today. Companies and businesses have to learn from today, that it's not just coming out with a new product or dealing with some crisis at work, but you need to be aware of what the publicity is going to be on what you're doing.
Yeah, so I would change that. If Goebbels says it, we call it propaganda. If we say it, it's public information or publicity. This was a very specific action taken with the intent of convincing audiences about a strategic message. Joseph Warren and Samuel Adams cut their teeth doing this at the Boston Massacre of March 5th, 1770. That's where they kind of learned this trade about turning a riot into a massacre, is all about the narrative. But they were brilliant in the days following the Concord raid in April 1775 at writing a detailed, legalistic, deposition-based narrative that was incredibly convincing. Because remember, the First Continental Congress told Massachusetts, we will be with you in a fight with the British, provided you are acting only on the defensive. So they had to convince the other colonies that they were not the aggressors, that they were acting purely on the defensive, and that narrative had an incredible impact. The British had a great difficulty recruiting for their regiments following the publishing of that narrative in 1775 in London. They had to go to the Germans, the German princes, for mercenaries and Hessians to fill out the troop strength that they would need in the Americas. Stateside, the colonies became united. And one of their first actions was to take this collected New England militia and dub them the Continental Army, and take a Virginian 2 days later and appoint him commander of that army there in the siege of Boston. So it's an incredible story that gets very little, press because it's in between the bookends of the Concord Raid and what is commonly known as Bunker Hill.
So you mentioned the Congress having named Washington. Look at that. We're almost 20 minutes into the show, and that's the first time we mentioned Washington, I think. So there are just many dozens of books. In fact, my friend David Stewart just published a marvelous biography of Washington this year that talked about his political acumen as an officer. What was your estimation of Washington as a leader during the period of time of the siege? I mean, what was it that during the siege that sort of showed us what kind of leader he would be?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as we look back, we all have to remember that George Washington, just like most of our forefathers, was an imperfect person. His constant companion everywhere he went on the battlefield was a slave, Billy Lee. But if we can understand that he was imperfect, in my estimation, I mean, my respect for George Washington went through the roof in all of the research I did for this book. To me, he truly was the indispensable man of the American Revolution. In the Boston campaign, he shows up at Cambridge Common on 3 July 1775. And the first thing he does is he asks, how big are we? How big is this new army? It takes him 3 weeks to get an accurate count. He asks, how much gunpowder do we have? When the count finally comes back at 39 half barrels, enough for 9 shots per person, he is speechless for an hour. He has to do everything. He has to create all of the systems that allow an army to exist: logistics, personnel muster, talent management, and the appointment of officers, law enforcement, if you will. The courts martial were going constantly. He had to create a sense of subordination. This is New England. New Englanders don't like to get told what to do. And yet they could vote their captain out if the captain did something that the rest of the company didn't like. And so no one wanted to be the bad guy and tell them you've got to dig latrines, or you've got to set up this thing, or we're going to go chop wood. No, we're going to have a vote. Okay, you're gone. And yet Washington had to start that early. And then finally, in late November and December of 1775, he finds out that most of his army is walking away. They had signed up only for the calendar year, and that calendar year was coming due, and he loses the entire army and has to recruit a whole new army all the time while besieging the best troops that the world had seen in the many regiments that were ensconced in Boston proper. He did that all while holding that siege together. Absolutely amazing.
So one of the things I've always found fascinating about this period of time is Washington dealing with these officers. As you mentioned, the militias had their elected officers who, frankly, like a lot of politicians, are more interested in just getting reelected and keeping their power than necessarily having the credentials to actually be a leader. What did Washington see in some of these young officers? How did he choose? I mean, the letters that you've read about Washington, how did he come up with people like Henry Knox and Nathaniel Greene? What did he see in some of these young officers?
It's a great question. Now, as you know, Congress really restricted his capabilities as the commander of that army. He could not make important decisions by himself. He had to do it in a council of war. Charles Lee pretty much existed in those councils of war to frustrate Washington's big decisions. And yet Washington was able to look out and see a Henry Knox, a big, overweight bookseller, and just sees this really fertile mind. He spots Knox when Knox is a captain in July of 1775, working on the fortifications. They start talking, and he starts inviting Knox over to his table for dinner. He's just an incredibly fertile mind. Knox is the one that comes to Washington in November, says, I got this crazy idea. I can go get the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga. Almost 60 tons of cannon dragged across the 400 miles from Fort Ticonderoga back to Boston. No one thought he could do it. And in fact, that was the impetus behind accomplishing the impossible, finding the people who can accomplish the impossible. Because as they say, when you say something can't be done, just step back and watch somebody else figure out how to do it. You brought up Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene was considered too lame to even be a private in the Rhode Island militia, but they finally allowed him to come on in. And within a year, he commands that militia unit. And within a year after that, he's brigadier general. And his Rhode Island militia during the early siege was the model of what discipline looked like and what correctness of tents and everything from cooking versus latrines. Because as you know, disease was the biggest killer of troops in the Revolution. And so George Washington would find these people and just bring the best out of them. One of my favorite is Rufus Putnam. Not Israel Putnam, not one of my favorite, but Rufus Putnam, another self-taught engineer that Washington was able to pluck up and empower to do wonderful things. The fortifications on Dorchester Heights, that was Rufus Putnam.
Bill, how did you use your military background to gain insight into some of these events, something that perhaps historians might not catch?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I consider myself fairly empathetic when I do staff rides. When I look at a situation, I try to put myself in their shoes, but I see the ground like a military person sees the ground. I see the challenges with subordinates or with privates and fear and overconfidence and biases, because I've had almost all of those same faults, probably still do. But I'm able to see things through the eyes of Gage as a military leader. I'm able to see Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, who led that first task force, the 841 regulars onto Concord, and kind of see what his soldiers were thinking about as they're about to surrender, almost out of ammunition, as they're fighting their way back towards Lexington. I don't know, my military experience has been wonderful in allowing me to stand in their shoes and to get some nuance from from their accounts that maybe other historians might miss.
So we have a question here from Holly Mayer, who I'm thrilled to see in our audience this evening. For those of you who don't know, Holly herself has written some wonderful books. She asks, was successful leadership at this early stage primarily of good management of disparate elements?
You know, Holly, it's a wonderful question. Let me talk William Heath and Joseph Warren in trying to coordinate militia units on the 19th of April, 1775. Heath had no authority over any of these militia units, and yet he and Joseph Warren, surely by their energy and constant movement around this moving box that harassed the British column, now under Sir Hugh or Lord Hugh Percy, as they're trying to get back to Boston, able to achieve unity of effort despite not having any formal authority over them. I think Washington's success was that he took this raw material of militias and added the systems of organization that allowed it to sustain itself over time. And it was a constant struggle because Congress was very, very slow and cheap, on payment for soldiers, on the procurement of logistics and supplies. So I think they learned management, and that enabled them to sustain over the long haul because they certainly were not super talented. We saw that at the Battle of New York. We saw that as Washington is beat most of the way through New Jersey. 1776, a bleak year until the end. And Roger gives tours of that bright spot in an otherwise pretty bleak year. A wonderful question. I think you can learn good and bad leadership from both the British perspective and the colonial perspective. And I think there's a little of both.
I thank you for that. Thank you, Holly. And as I suspected, we could go on forever. I know we could. This is, as I said at the beginning, meant to just give you folks an introduction to Bill and his book, Accomplishing the Impossible. As you might guess, I read a lot about the American Revolution. I learned so much from Bill's book, Accomplishing the Impossible. I put the link to purchase the book. A portion of the proceeds go to the research library for the Sons of the American Revolution. I also just wanted to let everybody know about a project that I'm working on right now. On December 26th, the anniversary of the Washington crossing the Delaware and his victorious raid on the Hessian garrison in Trenton, we're having a series of wreath-laying ceremonies in Trenton. And then again, at the end of the 10 Crucial Days on January 2nd, we're doing a series of wreath-laying ceremonies both at the Battle of Princeton and at Mill Hill Park in Trenton. What's exciting about these wreath-laying events is that we're going to have representatives of the Army National Guard who are descendants of the original units who fought in these battles. We are also going to have a major in the British Army, the Leicestershire Regiment, who is the descendant of the British 17th Regiment of Foot, who you see depicted in this painting behind me, who fought at the Battle of Princeton, is flying over from England to be at this event. So it's going to be a exciting series. I'll put some information about it on historyauthortalks.com for you all to see. But I encourage you all to look out and find your copy of Accomplishing the Impossible. And it's just a great read. It's why I wanted to publish it. I thought it was a great book to read, and I learned a lot, which is the recipe for wanting to publish a book. So I want to thank Bill. Thank you for your time. And I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. And be sure to go to historyauthortalks.com to see some of our other shows. I will just give you a quick highlight as to what some of our other shows are going to be, if you just give me a second here. Next week, November, we have Dr. Per Olof Hasselgren, author of Revolutionary Surgeons, the Patriots and Loyalists on the Cutting Edge. And the following week, well, actually November 16th, we've got Paul Lockhart, professor of history at Wright State University. His book is Firepower: How Military Technology Has Transformed the World. On November 30th, we've got a Books for Young Readers, a middle grade fiction by Robert Steed and his 90-year-old father, Links to Liberty. Links to Liberty is about a young story about how some teenagers helped defend the Great Chain at West Point. Then on December 7th, we have professor of history at University of South Carolina, Woody Holton, with his new book, Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. So that's who I have coming up. So I want to, again, thank you, Bill, and thank you all for coming. And I look forward to seeing you next on our next episode of historyauthortalks.com. Good night, everybody.